For generations, scholars were certain the Guanches of the Canary Islands were an isolated, primitive people who arrived once and then vanished into mystery. Their supposed lack of seafaring skill made their very presence on these remote Atlantic islands a puzzle that textbook history claimed to have solved. But groundbreaking DNA analysis has shattered this narrative, revealing genetic ties to multiple North African populations, evidence of repeated migrations, and a web of contacts no one expected. If we were completely wrong about the most basic facts of the Guanches, what else about our ancient past have we misunderstood, and why were the clues overlooked for so long? For much of the 20th century, the story of the Guanches seemed settled. Textbooks and museum displays described a people who arrived on the Canary Islands in a single migration, most likely from North Africa, then spent the next 2,000 years in complete isolation. Archaeologists pointed to the island's distance from the mainland, over 90 kilometers at the closest point, and the lack of evidence for boats or maritime technology among the Guanches. Early Spanish chroniclers, arriving in the 15th century, found only simple reed rafts and no sign of navigation tools or seafaring traditions. This supported the belief that after their ancestors landed, the Guanches lost the ability to return to sea or maintain contact with the outside world. Scholars relied on radiocarbon dating of cave burials and artifacts, which consistently pointed to an initial settlement between 1,000 and 3,000 years ago. The absence of imported goods, foreign pottery, or signs of regular trade reinforced the idea that the islands had remained untouched by outside influence for centuries. The Guanches' distinct language, customs, and burial practices were interpreted as the natural outcome of long-term genetic and cultural isolation. During Spain's Franco era, this narrative took on new layers. Official histories claimed the Guanches as a lost white tribe, emphasizing their supposed European features, tall stature, fair hair, and blue eyes in some mummies, to align with nationalist ideologies. Textbooks and museum exhibits highlighted these traits, downplaying or ignoring evidence of North African connections. The myth of the isolated primitive Guanche became a point of pride, a symbol of uniqueness for the Canary Islands and their place in Spanish history. Academic consensus held firm through the late 20th century. Population estimates suggested the islands supported between 30,000 and 100,000 people before the Spanish conquest, all presumed to be direct descendants of the original settlers. Genetic studies of modern islanders found high continuity in maternal lineages, with as much as 70% of mitochondrial DNA tracing back to indigenous roots. Yet these findings were used to reinforce the idea of a single ancient founding event rather than ongoing contact or multiple migrations. Dr. Juan Perez, a leading authority in Canarian anthropology, once summarized the prevailing view: the Guanches represent a unique case of human adaptation in isolation. Their origins can be traced to a single migration from North Africa, after which they developed independently, untouched by the outside world for 2 millennia. This certainty shaped generations of research, coloring every interpretation of the archaeological record. The story seemed complete until new questions began to surface, challenging the very foundations of this orthodoxy. A chain of volcanic peaks rises from the Atlantic, separated from Africa by a stretch of open sea. The shortest distance from Fuerteventura to the Moroccan coast is just under 100 kilometers, a gap that might seem small on a map but is vast for anyone without modern navigation. The ocean between is not passive. The Canary Current sweeps southwest, its flow reinforced by relentless northeast trade winds. These forces push anything adrift away from Africa, not toward it. Drift simulations using modern oceanographic models show that, in most seasons, a simple raft launched from Morocco would be swept south or out to sea, not toward the islands. Only in winter, during brief calms, do the odds of a successful crossing rise above 10% for the eastern islands. For Tenerife or La Palma, the journey is even more daunting. Distances stretch to over 200 kilometers and 400 kilometers, respectively, with currents and winds working against any return. Archaeological surveys across the archipelago reveal a striking absence. No boat fragments, no sails, no paddles. Excavations have uncovered cave dwellings, pottery, and mummified remains, but nothing that would suggest a tradition of seafaring. Coastal sites lack the fish hooks, nets, or shell middens that mark maritime cultures elsewhere. Even the tools for building or repairing boats are missing. The only vessels described by early Spanish chroniclers were simple reed rafts, barely suited for short coastal trips, let alone open ocean voyages. Yet the islands were settled. Goats, pottery, and cultivated plants appear in the earliest layers of habitation, all pointing to deliberate transport from the mainland. Some pottery styles match those found in ancient Saharan river valleys, hinting at a broader web of movement across land and sea. But after the initial arrival, the archaeological record grows silent on any further contact. Imported goods are absent. There are no foreign beads, metals, or new technologies arriving after the first settlement. The islands seem to have turned inward. Linguistic clues add to the puzzle. The Guanche dialects, though related to Berber languages of North Africa, show deep internal divergence. Some islands developed unique words and grammatical forms, drifting so far apart that mutual understanding became impossible. This linguistic isolation suggests centuries without regular communication, not just with the mainland, but even between neighboring islands. The lack of shared innovations or borrowed terms stands in stark contrast to the dynamic exchanges typical of seafaring societies in the Mediterranean or Polynesia. Every line of evidence points to the same contradiction. The Guanches arrived by crossing a hazardous stretch of ocean, yet left behind no trace of the technology or skills needed for such a journey. The island's geography and oceanic forces should have made repeated contact nearly impossible, yet cultural and biological hints suggest more complexity than the isolation narrative allows. The tension between what the land and sea reveal and what the old story claims grows sharper. The tools of archaeology and linguistics have reached their limits. The paradox stands unresolved, demanding a new kind of evidence, something hidden deeper than bones or words. Steel doors seal off the ancient DNA lab from the outside world. Inside, filtered air circulates through HEPA systems, stripping away dust and stray skin cells. Maya Alvarado, a technician trained in contamination control, steps into a pressurized antechamber. She slips on a full-body suit, double gloves, and a mask. Every movement is deliberate, every surface sanitized. Here, even a single flake of modern DNA could ruin months of work. The samples waiting on the stainless steel table are fragments of bone and teeth, some pulled from Guanche cave burials, others stored in museum vaults for decades. Most ordinary bone crumbles to dust after centuries, but the petrous part of the temporal bone, deep inside the skull, can shield DNA for hundreds of thousands of years. Teeth, too, protect genetic material in their dense inner layers. In 2016, a molar extracted from a guanche burial on Tenerife became the turning point. Its DNA, locked away since before the Spanish conquest, survived when almost nothing else did. Maya prepares the sample in a laminar flow hood, where ultraviolet lights have already sterilized the workspace. She drills into the tooth, collecting powder from the inner core. Extraction, blanks, control tubes with no sample sit alongside, catching any stray molecules that might drift in from the air. Each step is logged, every tool accounted for. The protocols demand redundancy. 2 technicians process the same sample in parallel, their results compared for any sign of contamination. Once the powder is ready, it's treated with chemicals that break open the cells and release DNA. Ancient fragments are short, damaged, and fragile. The lab uses next-generation sequencing to read every piece, no matter how small. Computers filter out anything that looks modern or out of place. Only sequences that pass strict authentication checks move forward. The process takes weeks. Most attempts yield nothing. But when it works, the reward is extraordinary. Genetic code from a person who lived and died 1,000 years ago. The DNA from that 2016 molar was pristine, uncontaminated, and complete enough to reconstruct entire sections of the guanche genome. For the first time, researchers could compare these sequences directly with those from North Africa, Europe, and beyond. The story locked inside the bones was finally ready to be told. The first complete guanche genome brought a wave of surprises. Patterns that had been invisible in bones and artifacts now stood out in sharp relief. Instead of the genetic bottleneck expected from a single isolated founding group, the data revealed a spectrum of maternal and paternal lineages far broader than drift alone could explain. Mitochondrial DNA showed not just one, but a web of haplogroups: U6B1A, H1CF, H2A, J1C3, L3B1A, T2C1D2. U6B1A, a branch found almost nowhere else, dominated ancient remains from La Gomera, but was missing from modern North African populations. On the Y chromosome, the Berber-linked E1B M183 appeared again and again, tying Guanche men to the mainland, but not to a single ancestor, rather to multiple lines converging in the islands over centuries. Autosomal DNA painted an even more complex portrait. The Guanches' closest genetic relatives were North African Berber groups, but their genomes carried echoes from across the Sahara and even faint traces from Neolithic Europe. When researchers modeled the genetic legacy in today's Canary Islanders, the results were striking. Between 42 and 73% of maternal DNA could be traced directly to the ancient islanders. Yet the diversity within those ancient genomes was simply too high for an isolated population. Statistical models showed that, had the Guanches remained cut off for 2 millennia, many of these lineages would have vanished through genetic drift. Instead, the islands preserved a mosaic, one that could only be explained by continued contact or repeated arrivals. Dr. Rosa Fregel, who led one of the pivotal studies, found herself re-examining assumptions that had shaped her own training. She noted that the Canarian branch of U6, so central to the island's maternal heritage, was absent in all surveyed North African populations, suggesting either ancient divergence or inter-island movement after settlement. The overall gene diversity among Guanche samples stood at 0.93, nearly matching that of contemporary Berber groups at 0.95. Such figures defied the isolation model. The evidence pointed to a series of migrations, not a single event, and hinted at ongoing links with the mainland long after the first settlers arrived. The old story of a people marooned by the Atlantic was dissolving, replaced by a new narrative written in the code of their DNA. Ancient DNA has forced a new look at the Atlantic itself, not as a wall, but as a route that could be crossed with intention and skill. The genetic diversity found in Guanche remains cannot be explained by a single accidental landing or a lone group drifting off course. Instead, the evidence points toward multiple migration events, each requiring a deliberate journey across open water. Haplogroups like U6B1A and E1B M183, with roots in North Africa but unique branches in the Canaries, show that the islands were not settled in one sweep and then forgotten. These findings suggest that early travelers possessed navigation skills that have long been underestimated. Crossing the 100 kilometers from Morocco to Fuerteventura, even in the best conditions, demanded more than luck. Ocean currents and trade winds push relentlessly away from Africa, making a successful voyage a feat of planning and timing. Experimental archaeology has shown that reed boats, like those used in the Sahara, could survive such a crossing during rare winter calms. Yet the genetic data goes further, implying that some crossings were not isolated events. Instead, small groups arrived over centuries, each wave leaving its mark in the DNA. This challenges the old image of the Atlantic as a barrier that isolated the Guanches from the rest of the world. The island's settlement now appears as part of a broader pattern of prehistoric movement, where people read the sea and sky and risked their lives for new beginnings. The absence of preserved boats or navigation tools does not erase the reality written in their genes. The Guanches' ancestors were not passive castaways, but active participants in the story of human exploration, reaching the Canaries through knowledge, courage, and a willingness to cross the unknown. Ancient DNA has done more than rewrite the story of the Guanches. It has opened a door onto the unfinished business of human history. For decades, scholars treated isolated populations as closed cases, unique, untouched, preserved in genetic amber. Yet the high diversity found in guanche genomes now challenges that assumption, raising questions about other so-called isolated groups across the globe. The Basques of northern Spain, long believed to be a remnant of Europe's earliest farmers, have shown unexpected genetic links to neighboring populations. Sardinians, once considered a genetic island, revealed traces of migration and mixing when full genomes are sequenced. Each new project, each ancient bone or tooth sampled, peels back another layer of certainty, exposing the gaps left by older methods and colonial-era narratives. The guanche evidence is a reminder that even the most familiar stories can be overturned by a few strands of DNA. The reality of multiple migration waves, ongoing contact, and hidden diversity means that the Atlantic, once seen as a barrier, may have been crossed more often and by more people than anyone imagined. But for all the answers DNA provides, it also sharpens the questions. Who exactly made these journeys? Were they Berber sailors, Saharan nomads, or others lost to history? How often did boats or rafts find their way across the currents, and what happened to those who never arrived? The next steps will depend on new technologies and new samples, complete genomes from all 7 islands, isotopic analysis of pottery and livestock, and the careful cross-checking of archaeological, linguistic, and genetic data. Projects already underway in the Azores and Madeira suggest the story of Atlantic settlement is far from finished. Each discovery forces a reevaluation not just of the Canaries, but of the very idea of isolation in human history. The lesson is clear: history is provisional, and the past is always waiting to surprise us. The age of certainty is over. The search for answers continues. History's boundaries shift with every new strand of evidence. Today, DNA forces us to reconsider who we call isolated and what we assume about ancient worlds. As genetic technology advances, more so-called mysteries will unravel, and many textbook certainties will not survive. The past is never as closed as we think. What other stories are waiting in our bones? Share your thoughts below.